It's episode 116 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Thanks for joining me each week as I bring you the best in author interviews. I hope you enjoy it. If you do, please go over to hankgarner.com, click on the links in the right sidebar to subscribe to the show, and visit our sponsors while you do, please. Ellen Campbell is a sponsor of the show. She is an editor extraordinaire. If you are a writer and looking for someone to help you get the most out of your writing, please go visit Ellen Campbell. It's ellencampbell.thirdscribe.com. Also, this week, we released the audiobook of The White Dragon Genesis, written by my good friend Stefan Boltz and narrated by me. I hope that you'll go pick up a copy of it. We've got a special deal for you this week. At the end of the show, there's a little audio clip of the book that you can listen to. And if you would like, I'm going to give away 5 free copies of the Audible audiobook. There's a link in the show notes where you can go over and pick it up. But the first 5 people to email me at authorhankgarner@outlook.com and just tell me that you would like a copy of the book. The first 5 people to do that, I will send you a free audiobook from audible.com. You can also sign up for audible.com if you're not already a member, and go to audible.com/Hank, and you can get a free audiobook. So please do that. Thanks for listening. Here's my interview with Blake Crouch. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. I'm very excited today to have Blake Crouch on the show. Some of you may know his work by the TV show that is out and making lots of news, Wayward Pines. Welcome to the show, Blake.
Thanks for having me on.
Sure. I begin each show with a variation of the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
I think my first memory was, I'm 6 years older than my brother, and I would tell him bedtime stories.
Yeah.
And they got progressively scarier and scarier, and he liked being scared, and I liked scaring him. And I just remember it was so much fun. And there was this one story that kept recurring, and I finally wrote it down so I would just have it. And that was the first vivid writing memory for me.
I love it. At what point did you take this love of scaring your brother and say, I think I could do this for other people?
I think the next thing I wrote that scared people was in elementary school. No, it would have been junior high. It would have been 8th grade. We had this class assignment to write a short story. And I wrote this lovely little story called In Shock, where the main character is watching the news, waiting for his wife to come home. While he's watching the news, he sees this horrible car crash coverage and thinks he sees the camera pan across his wife's face as one of the victims. And he's so distraught and he can't believe it. And he runs upstairs, grabs a gun, shoots himself, rises above his body dead just as his wife rushes into the room. And that's the end of the story. So you can imagine my teacher was a little concerned, and that elicited a parent-teacher conference very quickly.
I love it. What did your parents think of that?
The cool thing was everyone was really happy with the storytelling itself. They were very proud of me. They just wanted to make sure I wasn't deranged or, having, suicidal thoughts or something. And once they realized that everything was cool, it was a pretty interesting outcome because my teacher then made me stand up and read the story out loud to my class. And that's the first time I remember ever doing a public reading.
That's really interesting because there's this I don't know how to say this, but there's a line between people that have thoughts that are actually deranged and want to do harm to people, and then there are stories that we make up that scare us and scare other people, and they kind of help us make sense of the world. I wonder what that is that allows us to love these kind of stories, but allow us to be separated from them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I think it's the same reason people ride roller coasters.
Right.
It's the same reason people, what's what you're saying, why we love scary movies where people are getting chopped up and we're just terrified of what we're seeing on the screen. It lets us experience the thrill of it all without the very real danger, which is, I think, a healthy thing. It's a healthy thing for our psyches because, we clearly have some lingering violent tendencies from our evolution out of the primordial goo, and this, in theory, I guess, allows us to express and still stay in touch with those without actually going on a warpath.
Right. Who were some of your favorite authors? Who were some of the people that really formed your ideas about fiction?
I loved C.S. Lewis, The Chronicles of Narnia. I loved J.R.R. Tolkien. As I got into middle school, I really fell in love with Edgar Allan Poe, and in high school, Thomas Harris. So early on, my fiction reading tendencies definitely skewed towards thriller fiction with horror undercurrents.
Yeah.
And I love Silence of the Lambs. I read that when I was 13. But at the same time, I loved Pat Conroy. I loved Prince of Tides. That was probably the first adult work of fiction that I ever read.
Wow. So you've got these influences that seem to be disparate, but when reading your work, you can really pull these influences out. There's your work definitely has this thriller aspect, but these fantastical undercurrents and these great relationship moments. Do you ever feel those things tugging at one another with you?
You mean like pulling me
like
to go
a tension?
More?
Right.
Yeah, no, but I think that's what's good. I think that's where I finally arrived in my writing now that I'm in my mid-30s. I know that sounds young, but I have been writing since, forever. And my first book was published when I was 25. But like when my first book was published, it was more of the horror influences and the thriller influences that were manifesting in my writing. And now I feel like it's a lot more well-rounded. There is the science fiction, the speculative element, I guess I'd call it kind of the family drama. Like in this new book, Dark Matter, there's even sort of a love story at the heart of it. And I like the balance of all of those elements. And if that's the tricky thing, it's just trying to figure out how to write a story that feels organic and natural and is perfectly what it is, while at the same time comprising all of these different, I guess we should call them genre: horror, sci-fi, thriller, suspense.
Because that's what real life is about. In all of our lives, we have relationships with one another. We have odd things that happen that can't be explained. We have the things that scare us. So maybe that's one of the things that really endears your work to people is that they can see a little bit of themselves in there.
I hope so. I mean, that's the goal, to write something that, well, first, I write books that I would want to read,
right? That
I wish already existed, and I think readers want to see themselves reflected to some extent in the characters.
Sure. You said you published your first book at 25. What was that book?
It was called Desert Places.
What was your experience with publishing that book as compared to where you are now? Do you look back and think, oh man, I could have done this differently, or do you look back and say, you know what, I'm extremely happy with that. It's a accurate representation of who I was then, and I wouldn't change anything.
Oh, I wouldn't change anything. It's definitely not the kind of book I would write now, but I'm very grateful that I wrote a book then that found a publisher and that allowed me to kickstart my career, because it was an incredibly important first step, and I wouldn't have gotten to Dark Matter if I had never written Desert Places.
Right. And we're going to talk about dark matter in just a minute, but I think most people are probably most familiar with you at this point through your Wayward Pines series. How did that series come about? I know that you were a very visual person. You can tell that from your writing that it seems that you are. I think I've heard in another interview that you kind of get snippets of things, images, and those things take form into story. How did Wayward Pines come to be?
Well, when I moved to Colorado in 2003 and started going and taking vacations with my family up to this town that's about 70 miles north of where I live in Durango called Ouray, Colorado. And Ouray it's not really famous, but it's kind of famous around here because it has these beautiful hot springs and it's just scenically jaw-dropping. It's a town of 800 people at 7,800 feet, and it's just surrounded on all sides by these massive cliffs, and behind those mountains there is one road in, one road out kind of a place. Right. And I don't know what year it would have been, but I remember taking a walk one night, I don't know, 7, 8 o'clock, and it was still light enough out, and it was really quiet. And I was walking through this beautiful town, and I heard a phone ring off in the distance and just kind of echoed through the valley. And then I heard another phone ring. And I just had this very sudden, startling image of a character who was walking in a town just like this, but instead of 2 phones ringing, like literally every phone in town started ringing at the same time. And then people started coming out of their houses with weapons, homemade weapons, and chasing him, and that he had to run away from them and escape. And every time he tried to leave town, whether on foot or in car or with a car, the road just kept circling back, and there was no way out. And all of that arrived kind of just in a sudden flash of inspiration, and that was the start of Wayward Pines for me. And that's the scene halfway through the first novel in the trilogy, where Ethan Burke hears all the telephones ringing in town, and everyone in town tries to come after him and chase him down. But that was the start of Pines. And as I started asking myself, well, why can't this guy leave town? I kept seeing this amazing, first 2 acts of this book unfolding. Him arriving in town, not knowing where he is, not being able to call home, not having his personal belongings, being tormented by the local sheriff. I was actually kind of harassed by the local sheriff in Ouray on another trip, which played into Wayward Pines. But I had all of this, and it was building and building in my head, but I didn't know where it was going. I didn't know why any of this stuff was happening in this town. And so I stalled out on writing it for several years while I just tried to figure out why this town was so strange. Why couldn't he leave? Why couldn't he call the outside world? And I don't remember the exact day that I landed on what the big revelation is in Wayward Pines. I don't remember thinking at the time that, wow, this is like a groundbreaking moment in my career. I just figured out something great. I just thought I'd come across an explanation that fit with everything I was setting up, and it was something that I wanted to write. And I won't say what the big reveal is, just in case any of your listeners want to read the books or watch the show without having that spoiled. But it's a pretty huge twist.
How gratifying was it for you to write that scene that was so vivid to you? To get to that point in the actual writing, did it? What was that feeling like for you?
It was wonderful because it came naturally in the story I was writing, and it came at the right moment. And for whatever reason, it's just always been very important to me that my fiction writing stems from inspiration in my real life. It's not only sitting alone in a room trying to come up with stories. The best stories that I tell always come from some grounded real-life moment of inspiration that moves me to write the story.
When I first picked up Pines, I was not really familiar with the series at all. I think I saw it on Amazon, and and the cover was intriguing, and I downloaded it and I started reading, and it took a turn that I never expected. It started out and I thought, okay, this is this kind of book, and then it just like took a 90-degree left turn, and I was like, oh, it's this book, and you do that kind of several times through the story, and I love that because it keeps me guessing, and I'm like, oh my God, what is Blake going to do to me next? You know, that's such an amazing feeling. Do you see those kind of twists and turns coming as you're writing? Did you plan out these books all the way through before you started writing, or were some of these twists and turns a surprise to you as well?
Well, Pines was always meant to be a standalone. I didn't think when I started writing Pines that I was going to write a trilogy. I just thought I was going to write this cool story, Pines, and it would end with, well, the way it ends without ruining anything. But once I had finished it and I was starting to talk with my the team that made Wayward Pines, the television show, it was clear everyone was saying, well, what happens next? What happens next? And isn't there more to tell of this story? And I was like, well, yes, obviously there's more to tell of this story. How did I miss that? So at that point, I sat down and like before I start writing, I have a very good sense of where the story's going. I really see clearly the first 100 pages. The second 100 or 150, a little more vague. The third is kind of obscure, but there are goalposts that I know are out there and that are worth getting to. And, I mean, that's the way I wrote those books. But I didn't start writing Pines until I knew what the big reveal was, because that would have been so demoralizing to write everything up to the point where, you know, he finally gets out of town and finds out what happens.
Right.
And I have no idea. I mean, you just can't start writing until you have the goods.
Right. Pines has been turned into a fantastic TV show that's airing on Fox and directed by M. Night Shyamalan. How did that come about?
Before Pines was published, like I want to say several months before it was released, we started sharing the manuscript with some producers in Hollywood, and one of them, I mean, a lot of them sparked to it, but one of them smart enough to get me on the phone with this guy named Chad Hodge, who I'd never met, never heard of. And Chad had read the book. He was a TV writer. Actually, before this, he'd created the Playboy Club. And at first I was like, that doesn't seem like a natural progression from that to Wayward Pines, but sure, we'll talk on the phone. Anyway, we had like the best phone call ever, and he so understood this world I was trying to create. And he said, I know how to sell this. Instead of just pitching this, I'm going to write the first episode, which is called You Write the Pilot on Spec. And so he wrote this amazing first episode. And with that, we got M. Night Shyamalan attached to executive produce and also directed the pilot. And then we took it around to various networks in town, and luckily enough, a bunch of them wanted it, and we were able to get a production commitment from Fox.
That's happened to a couple of writers now. It's still a pretty rare thing, but it's becoming more common that a book gets film rights or TV rights sold, or at least getting a lot of buzz before the book actually comes out. That's really interesting. Do you see media changing in a way that's affecting storytelling, or do you think that these things are working more hand in hand now?
I mean, I think they can. When the stars align, they definitely can align. It's very hard to get a show into production. It's one thing to get an option, but for a show to go into production, even if as just a pilot, like that means the network is spending at least $6 or $7 million just to make that pilot. So to get over that hump is kind of a high bar. But I think maybe more people are getting over it because there's so many content platforms out there now. I mean, like Netflix is releasing like 500 shows a month or something crazy. I mean, not literally that many, but a lot.
It seems like it some days, doesn't it?
It does. There's just so many new places you can sell content that needs it. And I think it definitely is driving material like books as, springboards of television shows.
Yeah. I guess I was about a quarter of the way through Pines, and I picked up the audiobook and listened on a road trip and absolutely loved the audiobook. How do you feel about audiobooks? Do you feel like that they are a good tool for authors? There seems to be that seems to be a growing trend. A place where there's the most growth in book sales these days is audiobooks. How much of a hand do you have in your audiobook creation?
Well, for Dark Matter and for the Wayward Pines series, I just let my publishers, handle that. I was off making TV shows and trying to write books, so they trusted that to them, and they did a great job. I have a handful of books, the rights to which are under my control, and I commissioned audiobooks to be made for all of those. I think it's incredibly important to have your work available in audio. I mean, I read, but I also listen to audiobooks, and I don't think anyone just does one or the other now. I think it's a mix. When I go to the gym, I kind of pleasure to lay whatever audiobook I'm listening to, and it kind of motivates me to go work out. I'm sure I'm not the only person who does that.
Oh, no, absolutely not. That's one of my favorite things, driving or going to the gym or whatever, and just, with our busy lives, it sure is a good way to get more reading in, for sure.
It is. And, now with WhisperNet, with a WhisperSync, where you can actually have the book on your Kindle and you can go back and forth between the audio and the e-reader, it's making it easier for people to be reading all the time, which I am all in favor of.
Absolutely. Tell us about Dark Matter, brand new book. What's it about?
Dark Matter is about a guy named Jason Desson, and he is, when we meet him, a 40-year-old physics professor who's living in Chicago with his wife, Daniela, and their son, Charlie. And when we meet him, he is at a point in his life I think a lot of people can probably relate to, where he's happy, he's comfortable. He teaches at a sort of a second-tier college, teaches undergraduate physics to students who don't really care about it. But whatever, he's making a living, supporting his family. But 15 years ago, there was a moment where he was fresh out of his higher advanced degree program and cutting-edge research in quantum mechanics, and really on the cusp of this breakthrough. And right as this was happening, he met his wife. They decided to get together, and life sort of stepped in while he was making other plans, and now he finds himself at this, looking back at the road not taken, I guess is how I'd put it. And when we find him in the story, he's walking home to see his family, and he's abducted at gunpoint by this masked assailant. He's injected with a strange drug. And when he wakes up, he's in Chicago, but it's no Chicago that he knows. His wife is not his wife. In fact, he's never married. He doesn't have a son. And everything he knows about his life has changed, including he's not a professor anymore. He finds that he is, in fact, this world-renowned research scientist who is famous and who has invented something incredible. And I won't say any more for fear of spoiling it, but it's a big idea book, just like Wayward Pines, and I think I know it's the best thing I've ever written.
Wow. So there's a bit of this this portal fantasy, a bit like you can get a sense that you cut your teeth on C.S. Lewis. There seems to be this trend in your writing of people that find themselves in places that they didn't expect to be. I love that about it.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. People also struggling with identity and reality, and a bit of paranoid suspense. It's definitely a commonality in a lot of my books.
So Dark Matter is brand new. It's been out about a week, week and a half so far. Getting rave reviews on Amazon. Also, Publishers Weekly gave it a really favorable review. I look forward. I just picked it up today and about to start reading it. Is there anything that you would tell readers about the book that you would really like for them to get out of it? In all books, writers make dedications at the beginning of them, and I did something different in Dark Matter. I actually dedicated Dark Matter, at least, to anyone who has wondered what their life might look like at the end of the road not taken. And this truly is that kind of a book. It's a thriller. It also has a love story at its heart. And I wrote it for people who hate sci-fi, but also for people who love sci-fi. And I really wrote it for anyone who just loves compelling storytelling. I love it. I love it. Blake, we have a lot of authors that listen to the show. What's one piece of advice that you would give to someone who's maybe struggling in their journey? They've just not quite either found their voice or have not found the right outlet to have their voice heard. What piece of advice would you give them?
I didn't come up with this. I came up with half of it. And the first part of this will be familiar. The second part is something I came up with. Good is the enemy of great, but perfect is the enemy of finished.
I like your twist on it. That's so. What you're saying is, we can sit there and we can just whittle and whittle and whittle away at a book, and it'll never see the light of day. How do you come to the point where you can say, okay, I turned loose of it and set it free?
When you lose all objectivity and you don't know if the changes that you're making anymore are actually improving it. And for Dark Matter, it took me a good year to write the first draft, and I edited it for another 4 months, and then did probably 8 drafts altogether. And by the end of it, I was just, I had run as hard as I could. I couldn't push it forward anymore because I'd lost objectivity because I'd thought about it so much. I think you know when it's done. It's done when you just can't see the forest for the trees anymore. That's when you've taken it as far as you can take it, in my opinion.
Right. Well, the new book is called Dark Matter. I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes of today's episode. Blake Crouch, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. I know you've got other obligations scheduled, but thank you so much for coming on the show.
This was so much fun. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Where can people find all of your work and get connected with you?
They can go to blakecrouch.com. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the places.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to add links to all that in the show notes, and thank you for coming on the show.
Hey, my pleasure.
Friday, June 21st, 8:25 p.m., summer solstice, 10 years later. The last reasonable thought Hank Filler had before insanity took his mind was of his late wife. He'd lost her to a stroke a few years back. Since then, every evening during the summer, he took his small commercial fishing boat, the Atlantic Crawler, to a spot a few miles south of Fire Island. Sitting there in the quiet, the boat rocking gently in the water, he was able to remember her most clearly. He shouldn't be out here anymore. His sons had told him not to take the boat out any longer. His eyesight was failing him, especially at night. and he was beginning to forget things. But not her. Never her. So he sat there, engine turned off, the last rays of sunlight warming his face, and thinking of the 56 years he'd had with Sarah. And as always, he raised the small bottle of gin toward the sky. And as always, he let the tears run down his face while he drank, while he emptied the bottle. They weren't all tears of sadness. There was joy in them as well. The joy of having lived a full life. Now on the eve of his own, he had no regrets. He'd never seen fog in the evenings, not out here. He squinted his eyes against the setting sun. The fog diffused the light, softened it a bit. It sat a half-mile out, due south. He could still see the water and the sky behind it, but it was as if a veil had fallen in front of him. Hank thought his eyes betrayed him at first when he saw the silhouette of the three-master, its sails fully blown, breaking through the fog and toward him. It was as if it had come from another world. And it had. The hull black as night, the sails crimson with blood dripping from their edges and into the water. It blocked the sun, and at the same time the light made the sails glow deep red. He was unable to comprehend what he saw. But it wasn't the image itself that drove him insane, that stripped him of any reasonable thought. It was that came with it. For one moment, a moment that would last until he'd give his last breath 3 years later, he saw the place the red ship had come from. It was a world where the oceans were made of blood and the sun's heat scorched the land, where the thick toxic air brought forth great suffering in everyone, where the stars stood cold at night and eternal darkness was a promise to each of its inhabitants at the end of their lives. He saw those who had given their souls, boys not older than 19, maybe 20, who sat below, who with each stroke of the drum pushed the oars into the water, their tortured backs never resting, their hands bloody and with no skin left on them. She had taken them from their families, promising them to leave their siblings in peace if they accepted the brand on their naked chest, the sign that they now belonged to her. He didn't know how, but Hank knew at that moment that they had not brought any food with them. Each day, they would sacrifice one of their own for the others to survive. In the end, it was the pain he felt for them that pushed him into the dark corners of his mind, where he stayed until his final breath. The red ship, so it would be called from this day on, dropped into radar at the Shinnecock Coast Guard station for 1 second, only to disappear again right after. Nobody noticed it, other than Hank Filler. One person saw it that night. Only one.